So think about where this quote might have come from. I firmly believe that American society would not endure 10 years if subjected to half the trials and tortures we've been put through. And yet we have not been utterly destroyed, not by the world's strongest militaries. We have not been totally assimilated, not by the world's largest religion. Our religion is indeed concerned with being a good person, respecting one's family, ancestors, community, and the earth. And when these principles are lived, there is great strength. If I didn't tell you that these words were written about Native Americans by the philosopher Israel Morrow, you might have thought that they were written about our own people. Physical and spiritual survival in the face of persecution, respect and pride for time-honored rituals and practices. These are just some of the tremendous attributes that we can admire in the indigenous peoples of the world. In Canada and all over the world, there is a reawakening of indigenous identity and culture, a desire motivated by justice and animated by respect for diversity, to see dignity and equality restored and affirmed for First Nations. There is a growing commitment in liberal democratic countries to close the gap between the Indigenous and non-Indigenous when it comes to employment, education, health, housing, opportunity, and life expectancy. Last week, on October the 8th, while our Prime Minister was busy apologizing for an ill-timed surfing vacation, U.S. President Joe Biden became the first U.S. President to formally recognize Indigenous Peoples Day, a day that commemorates and honors Native American peoples and commemorates their histories and cultures. It is now a federal holiday in the United States that will occur every second Monday in October, as it did this past Monday. The date was chosen because Indigenous Peoples Day represents a counter-celebration of Columbus Day, the other American holiday honoring Italian explorer Christopher Columbus. Columbus's arrival on American shores marks the beginning of European life on this continent. And while some see this as reason for celebration, others see Columbus's arrival as the beginning of a period of tremendous violence and persecution, even genocide, for those indigenous to this place that was called Turtle Island. But I can't help but notice that this year, Indigenous Peoples Day happens to fall on the same week as Parashat Lekh, the Parsha which more than any other documents the origin story of the Jewish people. Lekh is a story of a man who is called upon to leave his home and everything he knew and to go to an unknown place that God has chosen. Parashat Lekh, more than any other, explains the origins of Jewish indigeneity to the land of Israel. Though we're not used to finding ourselves under the umbrella of indigenous peoples, it would seem to me that there's no question that it is where we belong. That was what I was trying to get out when I opened with Israel Morrow's quote. The land of Israel is where Jews became a people and the oldest monotheistic faith. It is where Jews achieved sovereignty before losing it and regaining it several times until much of the indigenous Jewish population was either killed or forced into exile following the Roman Empire's brutal suppression of the heroic Jewish revolt in the 2nd century CE. We're actually the only people known to have ever created a nation-state in that land. At all other times in the past 3,000 years, it was merely an administrative district in an empire whose center was elsewhere. The Assyrian, Babylonian, Persian, Alexandrian, Roman, and Byzantine empires, the Crusaders of the Holy Roman Empire, and the various Muslim empires such as the Umayyads, the Abbasids, the Fatimids, the Mamluks, and the Ottomans, and then finally the British. Archaeological evidence of Jewish life can be found in more than 30,000 sites in Israel, with antiquities dating back centuries. Even when we were massacred and persecuted by Christian crusaders, Arab and Ottoman invaders, the British-led Jordanian Arab Legion, or more recently, Hamas suicide bombers and rockets, our attachment to the land of Israel, both physical and spiritual, never wavered. Do I really need to explain more to this audience to prove my point? But for many, all of these historical facts are insufficient. This past week, the actress Susan Sarandon, who has in the past accused Israel of being a terrorist state guilty of ethnic cleansing, published a picture comparing the amount of land, quote, seized by Israel between 1918 and 2021, with a picture of land extracted from the original inhabitants of America between 1492 and 2021. Jewish Voice for Peace, a progressive activist organization in the United States, retweeted Sarandon's post on its official Twitter account and thanked her for, quote, supporting the campaign to return the land of Israel to its indigenous people and the Palestinian right of return and self-determination in their homeland, end quote. These points of view deny Jewish indigeneity to the land of Israel, preferring to see the Jewish presence in the land as equivalent to settler colonialist land conquests that occurred here in the West. This is an obvious misapplication of a Western progressive lens to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, which is complex and distinct. It is not just inaccurate, to me it is painful. Seeing so many people who believe greatly in exposing the world to the wisdom of indigenous peoples, respecting the history of indigenous peoples, but basically denying, denouncing, and delegitimizing the very core of Jewish national identity, which is our historical connection to the land of Israel. The campaign is aided by a suspicious effort to manipulate the definition of indigenous identity. Last year, the United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues put out an important statement to help in understanding what an indigenous people is. The document contains important statements celebrating indigenous culture and knowledge. It says this: indigenous peoples are the holders of unique languages, knowledge systems, and beliefs, and possess invaluable knowledge of practices for the sustainable management of natural resources. They have a special relation to and use of their traditional land. Their ancestral land has a fundamental importance for their collective physical and cultural survivals as peoples. Indigenous peoples hold their own diverse concepts of development based on traditional values, visions, needs, and priorities. Reading this, it would seem obvious that Jews are an archetypal indigenous people. The land of Israel has always been of fundamental importance to Jewish identity. We do have a unique language. It's Hebrew. We do have a unique and common source of wisdom. It's called the Torah, where we find our culture, our knowledge, our history. But in the same UN document, indigenous peoples are defined as forming, quote, non-dominant groups of society. In other words, according to the United Nations, to be indigenous requires subjugation by somebody else. If in the course of time, an indigenous people forms a majority in its own land and achieves self-determination, it's not indigenous anymore. The assertion is obviously ridiculous. But this is the UN. And there's really only one people I can think of who have achieved full self-determination on their ancestral lands, and that's the Jewish people. When it comes to denying our ties to our homeland, the UN makes an extra effort to find a way to exclude Jews and Israel in keeping with its well-known and well-documented anti-Israel agenda. For me as a rabbi to see this is painful, but as a Jew, it is even more painful. I believe that it is so important for us to learn respect for the cultures and stories of our neighbors with whom we share this land, particularly those who were here before us. In honoring Canada's first day of Truth and Reconciliation, I personally learned so much, and I'm so grateful for the awareness that it has brought to First Nations, Inuit, and Métis issues in our country. But how can it be that in so many corners of society, in this same place where we respect the stories of our neighbors, our story, the Jewish story, the story of Lekha, the story of the Jewish connection to the land of Israel, is subjected to erasure? Our story doesn't exist. Our story doesn't count. I should be clear. Jewish indigeneity to the land of Israel does not deny Palestinian indigenousness. Neither does Jewish indigeneity to the land of Israel oppose aspirations for Palestinian statehood. Palestinians are also an indigenous people. Recognizing them and their ancestral ties to the land does not mean that we disqualify the legitimacy of our story. We were on that land too. Actually, we were there before them. And building a monument over our sacred spaces does not make them yours. The assertion that the Jewish people colonized a foreign land to exploit its resources and native people is painfully inaccurate and reeks of anti-Semitism. Perpetuating this lie is hate speech. It ought to be exposed and denounced and refuted in the strongest way. I submit this not only because the settler colonial lens is false, but also because it makes the actual conflict more difficult to resolve. If Jews are settler colonialists, then compromise and negotiation becomes immoral. It was the framing of the conflict through the settler colonialist lens that prevented Palestinian leadership from accepting compromises that would have provided their people with an independent state in 1937, in 1947, in 2000, and again in 2008. Jews are not white European explorers. Actually, the majority of Israel Jews are not white, as that term is understood in the West, and the majority of Israel's Jews have actually always lived in the Middle East and North Africa among the Arab, Turkish, Persian, Ethiopian, and other populations of the region. But that story doesn't advance the other side's agenda, so it isn't told. So we are painted. We are actively being painted as something that we are not. Something that sadly Jews are very used to throughout our tragic history. And these libelous accusations contribute to anti-Semitism. The recent 80% surge in domestic anti-Semitism coincided not just with the latest round of violence between Israel and Hamas, but also with an onslaught of overheated rhetoric in our news and social media, a la Susan Sarandon. Rhetoric that turned into Jews being assaulted in the streets of Los Angeles and New York, while Jewish students, including in Ontario, were subjected to cruel taunts, false accusations, bullying on social media, inside their own schools and beyond. Mischaracterizing Israel as a colonialist, white supremacist enterprise is not only inaccurate, but dangerous. When people say to us, "Go back to where you came from," where do they mean? Where do we come from? Russia? Poland? Is that what they're saying? When they say from the river to the sea, where do they want us to go in the meantime? Well, you heard the story that we read from the Torah this morning. Israel is our home. It is the only home we have ever had. And all we're asking for is respect for that indigeneity among other indigenous peoples who deserve equal respect and affirmation around the world. The purpose of interfaith and intercultural work, which I deeply believe in, is to understand other communities as they understand themselves. Let me repeat that. To understand other communities as they understand themselves. That's how we get beyond the categories and labels that we are too comfortable using and start listening and learning from people's own stories. I spoke about this at length 2 weeks ago. All I'm adding today is my wish that the world make the same effort for us, that it stop using the labels and categories that it wants to use, and maybe listen to our story, that it make an effort to understand us the way we understand ourselves. It's all about respect. And it is from that place of respect where real dialogue and real sharing begins, and where real progress happens. From there, we do our part in fulfilling God's prophecy to Abraham, as we read this morning. V'nivrechu becha kol mishpachot ha'adama. Through you, all the families of the earth will be blessed. Shabbat Shalom.